Hello and welcome. This time we come to the seventh Sunday of the regular time. And our readings for this time, the first reading comes from the first book of Samuel, chapter 26. And here we skip around verses. So we have verse 2, verses 7 through 9, verses 12 and 13, verses 22 and 23. The second reading comes continuing from St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, same chapter as the last 2 weeks, 15, and this time it's verses 45 through 49. And finally, the Gospel is from Luke chapter 6, verses 27 through 38. The Gospel continues what we heard last week. You remember that last week we began in chapter 6, what is known as the Sermon on the Plain. Jesus had chosen 12 disciples, had come down, that is 12 apostles by name, had come down, had spoken to a large number of people, had, you remember, given his version of the Beatitudes, for blesseds and for woes. Now, immediately following this is the material that we hear this time, with a most familiar, and I'm not sure how much more we can really add to this, but most familiar line where Jesus is pictured as talking about the importance of love. Love your enemies. And in fact, in the little section that we look at are four ideas. As I say, the first part, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. And pray for those who mistreat you. And in a certain way, following again a pattern that is very characteristic of Luke, it is a turning around of things. So what Jesus advises us to do, or his hearers to do, is exactly opposite of the way in which they are or have been treated. In other words, throughout this section, Jesus is pictured as do not retaliate in kind, okay? Now, this idea of loving neighbor certainly is unique. Is it to the Testament tradition? In fact, we find in the Hebraic tradition, the great teacher of the first century probably was around when Jesus was, named Hillel, says, and here's what he said: whatever is hateful to you, do not do to anyone else. That is the whole law. All else is commentary. Go and learn it. That's the teaching of Hillel. And another interpretation or suggestion of this story is that Hillel says you should recite this standing on one foot, okay, so that the whole law can be, and all the teachings of the Hebrew tradition can be learned in this single statement. So certainly the idea of loving others is common to not only the Hebraic or Jewish tradition, but also to our Christian tradition. Now, it's important to notice, especially as we look at the section this time, that love is considered to be an action rather than something emotive. Now, do you love others? Do you love pets? Do you love even persons? And often the emphasis on love there is an emotional experience. And it's not to say that that's not important, but it is to say that that isn't the kind of love that is being described by Luke in this section. Now, there are, and I will take this opportunity here to look at this a little bit, And I do remind us that this whole section of Luke's message, I suggest, is being directed to an elite group, okay? Therefore, it is a group who, as we noticed on last occasion, are well off. In other words, they're not poverty-stricken. They're not those who struggle, if you want to make each day at the end, the ends meet, but they are somewhat well-to-do. And we'll see why I suggest that as we move along here. Now, there is three kinds of generosity here, or reciprocity. How do you like that for a word here? There is, and there's three levels of this, and important perhaps just to kind of review this. There is general reciprocity, which means that one shares one's goods with no hope of return. That very often that this is done, the best way to understand this is in terms of family relationships. I mean, parents take care of the needs of their children. How often do they get any kind of return for the sharing that they do? Now, I know you have remarkable 4-year-olds or 2-year-olds who, when you do something good for them, say, "Oh, Dad or Mom, what can I do back for you?" You do have extraordinary children, and we'd all like to meet them, and we'd all like to believe that your children are really like that. But parents, therefore, do not keep a strict accounting of the child's debt. Can you imagine that when the child now turns, say, 25, Mom and Dad say, "Now look, here's all the good things that we did for you over the last 25 years, and this is what we expect you now to repay." Yeah, sure, good luck in that one, all right? So children are hoped to respond with love and gratitude, but you can only hope that that's the situation. I know your children are, and the children that you know and the grandchildren that you're familiar with always do show that kind of return gratitude and kindness. All right, but setting that aside, that would be what we would call general reciprocity. You do something for others, and you do not really expect anything in return. Then you have balanced reciprocity. This is usually done in terms of what we would call neighborly relationships. We do satisfactory deeds for one another because it helps to establish mutual relationships, or the things that we do are mutually beneficial to one another. There is a certain we will do, I will do kind of things for you, and of course you in turn will do certain beneficial and kind things for me. So loving in return those who love you first, okay? And it's interesting who takes the initiative in these kind of relationships. Sometimes it's mutually at the same time, but often it's one or the other inaugurates it. And then is there a certain, well, they did something nice for us, maybe we need to do something back for them in order to keep the relationship working well. So that would be called a balanced reciprocity. And then the third time is what is called negative reciprocity, where relationships might be strained. One party hopes to take advantage of another by doing good deeds. In order to gain control in a certain way, you do something which, in effect, you know they can't repay you for, okay? And so in that sense, you are held, or they hold you, kind of in their debt. So there is reciprocity here, but it is not the balance that we noticed in the previous one. This gave rise, and we've spoken about this on a number of other occasions, to a custom known as hospitality. Particularly, it worked with regard to a stranger who, if that stranger came to your door, came to your town, and you welcomed that person in to your house, into your relationship, you were expected to give that person, as long as they were within the framework of your household, food, protection, and a place to stay. And in return, you were really expected not later on to attack that person, or heaven help you, but or to take advantage of that person. So hospitality became a very well-known practice. We've noticed this on many occasions, not only in the Jewish tradition, but in the whole of the Mediterranean culture. So hospitality, but it's called negative reciprocity because one group does all of the action and the other is reminded not to ever do anything toward that person. Or so what I mean is you might come to the household of your enemy, they take you in, they show you all these kindnesses, and later on you can't retaliate or should not retaliate against them. So those are three kinds of reciprocity: general, balanced, or negative. Now, again, keeping in mind that this gospel spoken to those who have goods. Why do I mention this? Well, for example, Jesus will say in the readings that we heard, in the reading we hear this time, the section of chapter 6 that we're going to be looking at, that if you have two coats, you should give one to one who is in need, okay? Now, do poor people have two coats? They're lucky if they have one. So you see, this is why I'm saying that it would, the suggestion of what to do would be based perhaps on the fact that the audience would and is capable of doing these things. So reciprocity here becomes a one-way street in a certain way, okay? Those who have surplus wealth, well, they're going to be encouraged to give to those who are not quite so fortunate. And again, you can see how this would not fall into what we would call a balanced reciprocity. That's why I go into all this little fanciness here. You should behave towards a stranger as you would toward your entire household. So all of this is a reminder: love your enemy. Now, do not retaliate, okay? And go back to a point that we made as we started here today. Turn the other cheek. We have looked at this before. There is some discussion, I have kind of reflected on this, is turn the other cheek, is it a slap, or is it kind of a friendly, yes, you're part of the household, or you're part of the friend. So how that striking on the other cheek is given may be interesting, okay? Could be simply a nice act, or it could be a little bit of a warning. Bless those who curse you. We have talked a lot. Now, cursing in us, remember, cursing is not using bad language, okay, or bathroom language. It may be not so good that we use it, but cursing is when we take God as our on our side and issue something unkind against another. So cursing was in the ancient world considered to be very bad. But rather than return a curse, instead return a blessing. Now, these are not easy things to do, admittedly, but important to keep in mind. Pray for those who mistreat you. Now, I often think you got to be a little careful here. Sometimes we very literally say a person keeps mistreating you and you keep saying, oh, I'll pray for that person and then do nothing to stop it. That isn't, and we've noticed this on other occasions, what love really could be. Love means you're not going to return an unjustified action against yourself in the same way. But it doesn't mean that there aren't alternatives as to how to respond in a loving way to try to break the cycle of vengeance and retaliation. So there's a lot more that could go on, and certainly we need to discuss these issues, as I'm sure our sisters and brothers in Luke's time also did. How often do you let others take advantage of you without taking some stance for the wrongness of what is being done? So we keep all of that in mind as certainly we listen to Jesus' advice here. But what we hope is, and that's the message, give to others just as you would hope that they would do for you in return. This is something that we need to keep working at. I'm sure that Luke's story here and his message on the plain was something that the early Christians struggled with. It was all well and good if you were well off to surrender your cloak or to turn your cheek or not to retaliate. But, and here's the point that I would make, do not retaliate in kind. So there may be another way, and sometimes if you can overwhelm another group or another person with kindness, that retaliates in such a way that they lose the fun of what they're doing. We have noticed that before I mentioned the turning of the cheek idea, if you turn, assume you use your right hand to strike and then you have to turn your cheek, you have to strike with the back of your hand, which was considered, we've noticed this on other occasions, insulting. Well, that was a kind of retaliation. It put the attacker on notice that he, if anyone noticed, was dishonoring not only himself, but dishonoring the person, and his public position would be not too well recognized. So there are different ways to retaliate, but not with the same violence, destructiveness, and hurtfulness that initially was the intent of the perpetrator. The first reading comes from the first book of Samuel. Now you will remember in the Old Testament, or in our Hebrew Bible, there is a series of books which are known as belonging to the Deuteronomic tradition, and there are 6 books that tell the story of Israel from its return out of the desert, years of wandering, to the entrance to the promised land. And those 6 books would be the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, the first and second books of Samuel, and the first and second book of Kings. Those of you who are very old and older books, first and second Samuel, first and second Kings, all fit into a category called Kings. So there was first book, second book, third book, and fourth book of Kings. Most Bibles no longer use that anymore, but I did want to at least just in passing make that correction. Now, what is the material that is told in 1 Samuel? It devolves around the story in the person of David. Now we all are familiar with the fact that, this becomes kind of evident in the opening of the first book of Samuel. Notice that the story we're looking at here is in chapter 26. But in the opening of the book of Samuel, the Israelite people are saying to God that they would, like the other nations have, a king. Samuel, the last of the great prophets, the first of the great prophets, last of the great judges, and he will turn out to be kingmaker, is opposed to the idea of a king. And we've noticed this on other occasions, but just to kind of fill this in to see where this story is going this time, don't have kings because, and he argues that there are all kinds of changes in Israel's way of life if they start to have a king. Someone has to pay for the king, for his court, for his the whole way in which he operates, for his army. He's going to want a standing army, where that was not something that Israel was used to. However, God overrules Samuel and says, let them have a king. And so then Samuel gets the job of anointing the first king, who turns out to be Saul. Saul in the beginning seems to be exactly what you would look for in a king. He's handsome, he's tall, he has all of the characteristics that make for a king. Teaching unfortunately, and this is more quickly summarizing the story, crosses the teaching of the teaching of God, and God decides that the kingship of Saul will be no more. He will not have an heir. In other words, when he dies, someone else will take over, but nobody in his family. It's with that in mind that then Samuel, is told by God to go and anoint the future king who will replace Saul. And that turns out to be a son of Jesse, the 8th son, a young, ruddy-looking fellow named David, okay? And as the story quickly unfolds, David actually does some work for and gets involved with the activities of Saul. And when the famous story that everybody remembers, the Philistine, who are the enemy of Israel at this time, giant. Now, a giant, remember, in those days is someone who is 6 foot or more, is considered to be a giant. Goliath suggests an interesting thought. Rather than lose all these men in battle unnecessarily, why doesn't each side send their own champion and let them fight it out, and whoever wins, that wins the war, and the other side surrenders, and that would, and there's a practicality to that when you think about it to some degree. Well, we all know the David and Goliath story. David triumphs over Goliath by using his little slingshot, and is taken into the entourage of Saul. The trouble begins very quickly is that the popularity of David begins to increase, and this causes Saul to become jealous. He does not like the fact that particularly the whole younger generation apparently liked Dave and not him, as well. And tensions got so bad that at one point, as they are sitting in the tent, Saul throws a spear at David, just missing him, and it clearly means that things are not going so well. All right, now a war breaks out between Saul and David. Saul is out to get, David. And that's the episode that's in the first reading here. That Saul is hunting down David with 3,000 men. David has grouped together about 600 men. And so, and they are being chased in an area which is known as Zippracha, which is just west, by the way, of the Dead Sea, so down in that area. And the episode that we hear is one night, David, with his nephew, Asbihi, sneaks into Saul's tent, and they catch Saul asleep. Now, his nephew suggests, what an opportunity to get rid of the king, and then you will be king. David, however, says, no, we can't do that. Takes the spear of Saul and his water jug and flees the camp. So that's the episode that we hear this time. Well, then they get to the other side of the camp, apparently on a little horizon, and shout out across to the camp, hey, Saul, look, and holds up his spear and holds up his water jug. Now, this wonderful kind of action on the part of David not to take the anointed one of God is perhaps showing, is it love for your enemy? I mean, you have to stretch this a little bit as to say, why is this reading chosen for our consideration this time? David thinks that the Lord will reward those who act with justice and faithfulness. Now, David here, and there are all kinds of reasons why he might have thought this, remains loyal to Saul even though he's out to get his life. After all, you might remember that David had married a daughter of Saul, Michal. All right. Now, some parts of the story have been left out, but as I think the reason for choosing it this time, as I mentioned, is simply that, do we say David is showing love for his enemy? Well, and not retaliating the way in which you might expect. Would Luke like that kind of sense? Yes. And of course, this put the leadership in Saul's camp in a difficult position. Because, by the way, to take the spear, see what happens is when the king went to bed at night, plunged his spear into the ground, that really was his tent. And that really was the area that should have been protected by, if you want, the Secret Service of the time. And that had not happened. Now, how come everyone was asleep when this happened? A good story, okay? Some say, well, maybe God's Spirit kind of moved over the tents or the areas where they were all sleeping and had the best night's sleep they ever had before, and therefore that's why they weren't aware of what was happening. We don't know, okay? And you love it, again, classically, as we end this, notice how many 3,000 men. Saul has 600 men. Has David, it's the old little against the big. We like that kind of story. And that is part of the characteristic throughout all of the works that are told in this Deuteronomic tradition. Well, again, thank you for being with us this time. If you have the opportunity, you might read some about David and his activities in the first book of Samuel. Thank you for being with us, and we hope to see you again.